War. As I've subtitled it, it is a clash of titans. In this war, we will see the two most powerful city-states of ancient Greece, that is Athens and Sparta, go head-to-head in a 27-year-long war that has some interesting and important historical consequences. By the end of this video, you should be able to do a couple of things. You should be able to identify the causes of the Peloponnesian War. You should understand the different strengths and strategies of Athens and Sparta, and you should understand the outcomes of the war and their historical significances. Finally, you should be able to define a couple of vocab terms: the Delian League, the Athenian Empire, and Thebes. We'll start with the causes of the war. And the first of these causes is Athenian ambition. What do we mean by that? Well, after the Persian War, Athens and Sparta emerged as the two Greek superpowers. These were the two city-states that worked together to beat the Persian Empire. And Athens, after the Persian War is over, sets up this thing called the Delian League. And what this means is that Athens, after the war is over, led all of the smaller city-states, especially the island city-states, to form a defensive alliance to prevent further Persian attacks on Greece. And this was a naval alliance where all of these city-states would give money to Athens to build a strong navy. Basically, Athens was the only place that had the facilities to build the ships that they needed to fight off the Persians. So the smaller city-states would give Athens money, and then Athens would build ships. And the idea was that Athens would use this huge navy to protect everybody else from the Persians in case the Persians ever attacked again. That was the original deal. But what actually happens is kind of different. What really happens is Athens uses the powerful navy that it builds with other people's money to force all of the other smaller city-states to remain in the league and continue to give money to Athens. Then Athens does basically whatever it wants with the money. So one thing that they do is they build the Parthenon. Perhaps you've seen that huge structure. Athens enters like a golden age, more or less, using all of the money that it gets from the members of the Delian League. This leads to a couple things. First of all, like I said already, leads to the Athenian Golden Age. It also allows Athens to, quote, rule the sea. They are by far the strongest navy in and around Greece. And finally, it leads a lot of other city-states to begin to distrust and resent Athens. Athens is basically pushing everybody around, making them give them money, and a lot of people are starting to dislike it. This growing mistrust of Athens basically leads to a split in the Greek world. And the split occurs between people who are allied to Athens in the Delian League and people who are allied to Sparta. How this happens is that a lot of people who are afraid of the Athenians join up with the Spartans into a counter alliance. Basically, they say that they'll help the Spartans out if the Spartans promise to protect them from Athenian domination. And this leads to a huge coalition of people opposing Athens. And as you can see on the map, basically all of the Greek territory is split up between these two groups. So Athens controls most of the islands and the coast all the way around the Aegean, but Sparta controls a lot of the land in Greece. And so what happens ultimately as a result of this split is that two minor city-states start to fight with each other. They start to argue. And this draws Sparta and Athens into the conflict because Athens backs up its city-state and Sparta backs up its city-state. And this draws all of the city-states into a huge conflict that we call the Peloponnesian War. The war that unfolds between Athens and Sparta aka the Peloponnesian War, is interesting because Athens and Sparta have totally different strengths and weaknesses. Sparta and its allies' main strength is that they are more or less unstoppable on land. And as you saw in our lessons on Sparta, Sparta basically has the best military that you can hope to have in the ancient Greek world. And this means that in a head-to-head conflict, Sparta would just crush the Athenian army. And because of this, Sparta just gets a bunch of guys and invades Athens and starts pillaging the countryside. They burn farms, they burn villages, but they can't destroy the Athenian cities because the cities have walls that are so high and so strong that they don't have the technology to capture the cities. Athens, on the other hand, their main strength is that they have this unstoppable navy that they paid for through the money of the Delian League. And so what this means is that Athens can just hide behind their city walls and use their navy to conduct sneak attacks on Spartan territory. So the Spartans march up and they burn and pillage farms near Athens. And Athens sails a bunch of soldiers down around to Sparta, and those soldiers burn farms and burn villages and then run away before Sparta can send an army to deal with them. And so what this means is that both sides can damage each other, but neither side can really destroy the other side's cities. These contrasting strengths and weaknesses lead to a war that neither side can win quickly. All they can do is poke at each other, but neither side can destroy the other side's cities. This leads to a war that drags on for 27 years. 27 years of brutal combat. What finally tips the balance in favor of Sparta are a couple of things that really hurt Athens. The first thing that happens is that a plague goes through Athens in the early years of the war that kills many of its citizens, including a number of its most important and influential leaders. And the reason that this plague happened is because the Athenians would all retreat whenever the Spartans invaded the countryside, and they would all hide inside the walled cities. But then there were so many people crammed in such a small place, there wasn't enough clean water, there wasn't a good enough sewer system, and so the unsanitary conditions eventually caused the plague to break out. And that seriously weakened Athens and its allies. Also, what happens eventually is Sparta goes and does a deal with Persia, Greece's old enemy. And Sparta says that Sparta gets Persia to ally with them, and Persia gives Sparta money to build a huge navy also. So by the end of the war, Sparta's navy is as good as Athens' navy, and this allows Sparta to destroy the Athenian navy and ultimately to blockade Athens and force Athens to surrender. And so Sparta wins the war, but only after 27 years of brutal combat and making a deal with Persia. The aftermath of the war is really significant. First of all, both sides are permanently weakened. 27 years of war has drained the resources of both sides. The Athenian Empire is dismantled by Sparta. The Spartans have destroyed the Athenian navy, and they also prevent Athens from ever rebuilding their powerful navy. This also leads to a lot of political turmoil in Athens and the decline of democracy. Right after the war is over, a bunch of tyrants take over, and it's a period of chaos. But Sparta is also weakened. A lot of Spartans have died during the war, and the population of Sparta never recovers back to its former level. And so Sparta, even though it wins the war, doesn't really come out ahead. This allows for the rise of Thebes, and Thebes is another city-state that emerges as the most powerful because Sparta and Athens have basically seriously weakened each other. And Thebes, around 404 BC, that is not very long after the end of the Peloponnesian War, is able to defeat Sparta in a straight-up land battle, which would have been impossible to imagine 30 years earlier, before the war had been fought. After this happens, and after Sparta and Athens decline, we get a long period of instability and conflict, where city-states are constantly fighting wars with each other, but nobody's really coming out on top, and nobody emerges as powerful enough to unite all the city-states again. And this continuing warfare weakens everybody. Athens and Sparta and Thebes and all the other city-states are weakened because they're constantly fighting each other. This situation is only resolved when outsiders from the north, from a country called Macedonia, invade in 359 BC. And Greece is so weakened at that point that the Macedonians are able to conquer all of the city-states and unite them under a foreign ruler. We'll talk about this more in a couple of days. From this story. Well, first of all, the Peloponnesian War was a war that nobody won. Sparta and Athens more or less both lose, even though Sparta destroys Athens. It also leads to a period of chaos that weakens all of the city-states. And finally, it makes Greece vulnerable to outside invaders. And it basically leads to the end of this classical period of Greece dominated by city-states, and leads to a later period that is characterized by vast empires. And this is the time period of Alexander the Great, who will become very important in a couple days.